theyeshiva.net.
The Rambam says if he predicts the negative, maybe it cannot materialize because Hashem decides not to do it, because the person changed. You're asking, the Rambam said before that Hashem is immutable. It's not Hashem changes, it's the person changes. If the person changes, so then the decree applied to this person, like Nineveh, was destroyed because of their corrupt behavior. But if Nineveh is not Nineveh anymore, it's a different Nineveh, so then the decree doesn't apply to Nineveh. The decree applied to this person, not to the other person. Didn't many of the prophets predict doom and gloom? Yes, they of course predicted doom and gloom. However, where do you see the truthfulness of a prophet? You can't see it in doom, because that will not prove him true. You see the truth of a prophet in the positivity. That was my point. And that's the point, that when a Navi predicts doom and gloom, it's not to predict doom and gloom, it's to warn the people so they can change their behavior. How many times do we test a prophet? So the Rambam says, Pa'amim Rabbis. The Rambam says, we test a prophet many times. But Pa'amim Harbe. I know that the Turei Even writes 3 times. And he proves it from the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was sent to Mitzrayim, Hashem gave him 3 signs to perform in front of Paroi and in front of the Jewish people. So we see from here, why 3 signs? So we see from here that you could test the Navi 3 times. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu got 3 signs. You remember in Parshas Shmos, right? He gives him 3 signs. You have the stick becoming a snake. Moshe Rabbeinu's hand becomes leprous. He takes out his hand from his bosom and it's white like a leper. And the third thing is he pours water and the water is transformed into blood. So those are 3 signs. And what's the language? If you look at the language in the Chumash, after Moshe says they're not going to believe me, so Hashem says, what's in your hand? A stick. So he throws it to the ground and it becomes a snake. Then he says, put your hand in your bosom and take it out. And his arm looks like it was the hand of a leper. It's white as snow. And then it goes back to regular. And Hashem says, if they don't believe you because of the first wonder, then they'll believe you because of the second sign. If they don't believe the first 2 signs, then do the third sign. Take a little bit of the water of the river, pour it out on dry land, and the water will become transformed into blood. So the Turei Even says, from here you see that a Navi could be tested 3 times. But it's interesting, the Rambam doesn't say 3 times. The Rambam says, Pa'amim Harbe, many times. If I were to be asked what the Rambam means many times, maybe there's a reason he doesn't say a number. Because the Rambam is trying to tell us something. And that is, maybe there's no number. Maybe you have to have healthy skepticism and do it enough that you know for sure he's a Navi Emes. In other words, one time you could say, okay, there was he's a good astronomer, right? He's a good scientist. He had access to NASA. He had access to NSA information. Whatever. You could say it was a good guess. So the Rambam says, take your time. If you have to check again, don't come to a swift conclusion that he's a prophet because you want to believe that he's a prophet. Sometimes you could check him twice, sometimes 3 times, maybe sometimes you check him 6 times. But apply healthy skepticism, not unhealthy skepticism. Don't stubbornly and tenaciously cling to the belief that everybody is a liar and therefore you will always find something. That's the point at the end. You have to test him many times, fine. But once you see that this man is an ish emes, every word that came out of his mouth is true. And remember, it doesn't begin and end with that. You have to look at the whole person. You have to see how the person lives. You have to see who this person is. The Rambam in chapter 7, you remember, spoke about all of the conditions, all the criteria, all the prerequisites of how the Navi works, how he lives. As the Rambam said, he's in control of every single natural inclination in his life. Ein yitzrim is gaber alav b'shum davar b'yolam. His inclination doesn't prevail in anything in the world. Everything he has full control. And he spoke about his expansive consciousness and his mind and his behavior and his commitment to truth. And the fact that you will never find this person submerged in futility, in idleness, in toxicity and negativity. His mind is completely connected to truth. You see a person. He follows the path of prophecy. And that path is very intricate and very nuanced, and people could see that. Then he does these predictions. And of course, he's claiming that he's a Navi. He's telling you that he's a Navi. And the Rambam says you tested him once and twice, many times, and now you see that this person is truthful. Now the Rambam says, enough. He's a Navi Emes. But the Torah Yevon says it's 3 times. The Rambam, in these chapters, keeps on making reference to Parshas Shoftim, Parshas Re'eh and Parshas Shoftim, because those are the 2 parshas that discuss Nevuah, prophecy, both true prophecy and false prophecy. And that's why in these last chapters, the Rambam makes quite a few references to these psukim. There's a fascinating Baal HaTurim in Parshas Re'eh. It's actually going to be read in 2 weeks. Parshas Re'eh, the Torah speaks about Ki yakum b'kirbecha navi. If you have a Navi who rises up from amidst you, and this person who seems like to be an authentic prophet, it says Ki yakum b'kirbecha navi oicholim chaloim v'nosen elecha oisam oifes. From amongst you stands up a Navi or a dreamer, and he gives a wonder. He creates a wonder or a miracle. And it's a great miracle, but there's only one condition. There's only one detail. Following the miracle, you know what he tells you? He says, God told me that you should worship idolatry. You should engage in some pagan idol. So the Torah says, you know for sure that he's an absolutely false prophet. There's no issues, there's no questions, there's no dilemmas. He performed the miracle, as the Rambam told us, that if a Navi tries to tell the Jews to worship Avodah Zarah, even if it's temporary, as he said in chapter 9, you know for sure that he is a liar. The Baal HaTurim was one of the great commentators on Chumash, Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal HaTurim. He was born approximately 1269 or 1270. He was born in Germany. His father was Rabbeinu Asher the Rosh. They escaped to Spain. The Baal HaTurim, Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal HaTurim, passed away around 1340, which would be Hey Alofim Kuf. In the Hebrew calendar would be 5100. He wrote the Sefer HaTurim, which is the prerequisite of the Shulchan Aruch. A lot of it was inspired by the Rambam. 4 rows of halacha, Chaim Yerdei Avnezach Mishpat. And I should mention, when the printing press came out, the second Hebrew book that was published, that was printed, is the Torah Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal HaTurim. In Parshas Re'eh, when the Torah says, Ki yakum b'kirbecha navi, when from amidst you rises a prophet, makes miracles, and then says to go worship idolatry, you know that it's a lie. He's a false prophet, and therefore he should be put to death, as the Rambam told us. The Baal HaTurim says something strange. He says, B'kirbecha, the word B'kirbecha has the numerical value of 324. B'gematria zu ha'isha. It's the same numerical value as, this is the woman. Beis, Kuf, Reish, Beis, Chaf is 324. Kuf is 100. Reish is 200, that's 300. Chaf is 20. And Beis is 2 and 2, so it's 324. Zu ha'isha is also 324. This is the woman. For many generations, people were completely perplexed. The pasuk says, from amidst you rises a prophet. From amidst you, Bekir Becha, amongst you rises a prophet who's a liar. And the Baal HaTurim says, this is the woman. There's a woman, a liar, a prophet who rises among you, and she's a liar. And that's why you'll see many editions of the Chumash with Baal HaTurim don't have this Baal HaTurim, because it's so enigmatic, it's so strange, it's so difficult to understand. They just deleted it. They said this has to be some error here in some manuscript, and the whole thing should be deleted. And a lot of, I checked today in the Chumash, and I saw it's a good Chumash, it's a pretty new Chumash. They don't have this Baal HaTurim. There's an amazing tradition that they trace back to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger, who lived in the 1700s and in the early 1800s. So this is brought in some works, the name of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And he said something fascinating. And he says as follows, that the Baal HaTurim actually was referring to something specific. Who was he referring to? He was referring to Oisei Ha'ish, Yeshu HaNoitzri, and his mother. Because in the Christian religion, of course, the Trinity, right, is very much focused on Mary or Miriam and her son. Yeshu, Yoshka, Oisiyayish. The Baal HaTorah was referring to the mami and the boy who became so-called prophets speaking in the name of God. And according to the disciples, he performed quite a few impressive miracles. But ultimately, this was a call to change Torah, to change Yiddishkeit, including to engage in pagan, idolatrous ideas and rituals, and therefore you know that it's false. So the Baal HaTorah was referring to Oisiyayish and his mother. This is an example of the false prophet that Torah is describing, which means, fascinatingly, he may have done all the miracles. Some people think the reason Jews didn't accept Christianity is because the miracles are false. No, nothing to do with that. Like the Rambam said yesterday in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah in chapter 9, the Rambam explains, nothing to do. A Navi could do all the miracles in the world. If he changes one thing from the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, then we don't believe him. If he adds a mitzvah, if he takes off a mitzvah, if he tells you to worship Avodah Zarah, anything that changes, if he says that Torah and mitzvahs are obsolete, even one mitzvah, it's not applicable anymore, it doesn't apply to our days, you immediately know he's a false prophet because he's denying the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. So that's why we know that he's a false prophet. It's mamish irrelevant if he did the miracles or didn't do the miracles. Maybe he did them, maybe he did not do them. As the Rambam says, even if he stops the sun in the sky, and even if he stops the moon, and there's no orbit, even that is not enough to cause us to deny the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Which is a very fascinating Baal HaTorah. The problem is, the Baal HaTorah doesn't speak about Yashki, he speaks about a woman. He says, Bekirbecha zu ha'isha. Bekirbecha zu ha'isha. Okay? So there's this fascinating tradition from Rabbi Akiva Eiger that they say as follows. He said that we don't have the full Baal HaTorah. He wrote something else. Bekirbecha navi begematria zu ha'isha ubna. In our Baal HaTorah it says Bekirbecha is 324, Zu ha'isha is 324. But Kivega says really, he said Bekirbecha Navi. Add the word Navi. Together, Bekirbecha and Navi is the numerical value of Zu ha'isha ubna. This is the woman and her son, referring to Mary and Yashka. That's what it means. And now we understand what the Baal HaTorah is saying, that the Torah, thousands of years before the rise of Christianity, predicted that there's going to be a woman and her son who are going to embody this type of prophet, this type of prophecy. You should know that it's a false prophecy. I just want to say, it's a very, very great chap. It's quite an interesting insight. However, there's no source for it in any manuscript of the Baal HaTorah. I think that the more, even though it's fascinating and the idea itself is absolutely true and authentic, and this is what we've been learning in the Rambam, but I think that a much more accurate reading of the Baal HaTorah is a little more straightforward and simple. And it's been suggested, I'm not the first one to suggest it. If you open up a Sifri, the Sifri, which as we know from the introduction of the Rambam was written by Rav, and it's one of the Medrashim, the oral traditions of commentary on Sefer Bamidbar and Dvarim called Sifri. Sifri de Rav, which was authored by Rav, the student of Rabbeinu Yehuda Anasi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, who authored the Mishnah. So the Sifri says as follows. It says, Ki yakum bekir b'chanavi. If a prophet rises amongst you. So the Sifri says, L'rabois ha'isha. This includes a woman. What is the meaning of this? The Sifri is perturbed by the superfluous word bekirbecha. Should have said ki yakum navi. If a prophet rises and predicts the future or does a miracle and then tells you to go worship idolatry, you know that he's a liar. Why to say if a navi amongst you rises? Obviously he's amongst you. He's not living on planet Mars. Obviously he's amongst you. Where should he be? Amongst the frogs? Amongst the sea creatures? Of course he's amongst you. Where does he come from? He's a person. And what if he doesn't live in your neighborhood, he lives in another neighborhood? So the Sifri says, Rabbi Sa'isha. Bekirbecha is teaching you that it's not only men. You might think this only applies to men. So he says, Ki yakum bekirbecha navi. Yakum is in the sea, you would think is yakum, which is masculine. So he says, no, it's not only a navi, a male man who stands up, even a woman who stands up and says that you should go worship pagan idolatry, even if she does a stupendous miracle, you should know that she's a liar, she also gets the death penalty. That's what the Sifri says. Bekirbecha is Rabbi says ha'isha. The word bekirbecha teaches me there's not only halacha about men, it's also halacha about women. And the truth is, we know that prophecy applies to men and women equally. When the Rambam started to introduce prophecy in chapter 7, he says, Yesodei HaTorah shakel menabe es bnei ha'adam. Hashem gives prophecy to human beings. It includes people of all genders, in fact, people of all different nations, including men and including women. If this is the truth, this is what the Sifri says, now the Baal HaTurim is very clear. The Baal HaTurim is showing that the Sifri is not just a far-fetched explanation. When it says Bekir B'cha, it's an extra word, and therefore we say it adds women. It adds a woman. It adds also the halacha that a woman is included. The Baal HaTurim shows that the very word Bekir B'cha already includes and intimates this, because the gematria of Bekir B'cha is Zu Ha'isha. It's a woman. So the Sifri becomes much clearer. It gives us a new depth and a new clarity in the Sifri. It's not just the Sifri is saying the extra word means to include women, but actually the word itself, the numerical value of the word Zu Ha'isha. And according to this, it has nothing to do with the Christian mother and the Christian child and the Trinity, nothing to do with that, even though the idea itself is, of course, authentic. This is an interesting story. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful day.
This class is brought to you by the Yeshiva.net. Please help us continue the classes. Make even a small contribution at www.theyeshiva.net/donate.